podcast with Maryland Focus and Howard County Roots. My name's Tom Cole, and I'm still hanging out in my basement while I'm connected via the miracle of the internet to my dear co-host and friend, Candace and Reed. Candace, how you doing?
Good. I'm doing really well. I am really excited about our guest today.
Yes.
Excited to welcome Wes Moore to the show. He has appeared on national news sites, national news shows, even hosted his own show on the Oprah Winfrey Network. So we feel really fortunate that Wes has joined us today. This is funny. This is our second Rhodes Scholar in the past month. And Wes, I think you'll appreciate this. The other one was Dan Porterfield, who we know that you know, and he said he'd be listening today, so it's fun.
That's my guy. He's actually one of the reasons I got a Rhodes Scholarship, but we can talk about that later on.
All right. We're going to get back to that. I mean, I'm very excited because I love when we have authors on the show, because then I get to request a media copy of the book, and I've been just digesting 5 days. Like, I love it. I particularly love it. Anybody who has worked in Baltimore or lives in Baltimore, you need to read this book, because it is not just the incredible story of the 5 days after Freddie Gray's death, but it is also just about the various personalities and constituencies that make Baltimore work. So very excited about it. Highly recommend the book. We'll talk about it in the interview. But first, we got to do our three things. You want to go first? I go first.
Sure, I'll kick it off.
All right, go ahead.
So at the May 14th board of education meeting, Dr. Materano, at the end of the meeting, talked about some MPIA safeguards that he was putting in place. And I'll just read just a portion of what he said, because I think this is poignant to the conversation. He said, unfortunately, over time, some people have taken advantage of transparency of the PIA portal, not to reveal information about the operations of the school system as intended, but instead to attempt to discredit public employees and elected officials. I just wanted to go on record for applauding for the superintendent for doing this. I think it's important, the MPIA procedure, and I think we're only one of a few school districts that have this, is meant to make sure that the public can know more about what the school system is doing. And that's great. But we've seen in the past year, as we looked at redistricting and as we went through that process, that community members are sort of weaponizing the MPIA system. And I applaud the superintendent for taking this measure to say that he wanted to safeguard the process against abuse. And I just wanted to make sure that we talked about that today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great and welcome new move, as two people who were targeted by the MPI system. We're glad to see a revision, but it's more sad, and I mostly agree with the superintendent when he is saying that he wishes that he didn't have to do this. So here's where we are, and where do we go from here? How do we make it so that people just, I don't know, treat one another better, don't weaponize our public school system to hurt people? What are your thoughts on that, Candace?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think there is a place for transparency, and we certainly both appreciate that, and I'm sure Wes appreciates that as well. And that was the intent of the process. But once people start to abuse that to attack people publicly, I just don't think that's right. And so, again, I applaud the superintendent for putting new measures in place to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's also, let's talk about the bigger issue of public resources and educating. What is the school system for, and why are politics so nasty that this was necessary? So.
Right. What else are you thinking about?
I am thinking about the Baltimore Sun.
Right.
Our Baltimore Sun and the reporters with the Baltimore Sun, there's a new effort called Save Our Sun, which is launched in partnership with the Baltimore Washington News Guild, the News Guild CWA, and a committee of media leaders to support efforts to return the Baltimore Sun to local ownership under a nonprofit model, reinvesting profit back into the paper, and for a newspaper that is a cultural and media institution. And this has been, supported and promoted by all of the reporters that we care so much about, Pamela Wood, Luke Broadwater,
Liz Bowie.
Liz Bowie, there we go. So this is really, it's a new model, and we talk often about if local media is going to survive, it's going to need a new model. And so it's both exciting while at the same time scary, because with new models comes risk, and we can't lose the Baltimore Sun. We can't lose this institution. And I think the people that are proposing this, they're not going to let us lose the Baltimore Sun. They know more about media than, respectfully, I would say, the people that own the Baltimore Sun. So I'm pretty excited about it. What do you think, Candace?
There's a petition going around. Wes, I think you signed onto that.
I did, gladly.
Yeah. And Dr. Basky, head of UMBC, who's my boss, signed on as well. And I think it's important for us to support the Sun in this way and to support the reporters. And I think it's a great thing. I hope that it happens, and any way that we can save a local institution like the Baltimore Sun and really save local jobs, I think it's truly important. So I'm excited to see what happens with it. And we happen to know a few of the folks who are on the Save the Sun committee and the campaign, and we really appreciate their voice and know that they would do something that was, and know that they do things that are important for the institutions in our state.
I'll jump. So in transparency, I have been public and very public about my support on this. I just believe that a nonprofit Sun will be a better paper with more resources. It will provide an important watchdog facility that the city needs. The city needs good journalists, and the city needs a paper that can then support it. And Ken, as you just brought up a really, really important point, is that this is a local institution and these are local jobs. And if we can come up with a framework to both be able to have a quality product and save jobs, then this is something that we all should be reinforcing back in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's hope the petition gets their attention, because I mean it is something that needs to be acted upon by the other side, and hopefully they understand that the thousands of people that have signed on to this are local media supporters, and we'll link to the petition after the show. We'll make sure it's on the show page, but we would encourage all of our listeners and viewers to sign on.
Yep. And the last thing that we're thinking about, we are, many folks know that we are members of Howard County for All. We are hosting a Board of Education event next week to just have a conversation with Board of Education candidates here in Howard County. There will be more information coming out very soon about that, but we think it's important to make sure that we, as a group, are recommending Board of Education members who will stand up for equity and who will make sure that resources and we'll work on the achievement gap and make sure that resources are available for all. So I'm excited about that. There will be more information about that soon, and I think it's really important to announce.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say this is not an Elevate Maryland production. It's not going to be you and I interviewing the Board of Education members, but I think one thing that's become more apparent now, especially over the last year, is just how much an equity lens needs to be taken to the Board of Education elections, and just how important they are, especially I think because of the opacity between the voters and the candidates. I mean, they are nonpartisan. We don't know what ideology they may subscribe to on the grander sense. All we can do is interpret their responses to questionnaires or responses to questions such as may be offered at this forum. And so the burden is heightened on voters for the Board of Education race. And we would encourage our listeners and viewers to take on that burden and really dive into the Board of Education race. It's made a little bit more accessible by being by district now. You don't need to evaluate 18 candidates. You at most need to evaluate, I think, 5, 4. I don't recall how many are in District 5, but we're excited about that. I'm excited that Howard County for All is doing it. I will not be asking questions. I don't know about you, Candace. I can speak for myself. You don't need to worry about me putting my finger in the stew. But it should be a great opportunity for listeners.
And there'll be some good questions. Trust me on that. And now I would like to officially welcome our guest to the show. Wes Moore is the CEO of Robin Hood, one of the largest anti-poverty nonprofits in the country. He is a best-selling author, a combat veteran, and a social entrepreneur. His first book, The Other Wes Moore, was a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller. His second book, The Work, was also a bestseller and was featured in Oprah's Super Soul Sunday. His new book, which he wrote with New York Times rock star and friend journalist Erica Green, is called 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City, and is, and I quote, a kaleidoscope account of 5 days in the life of a city on the edge, told through 8 characters on the front lines of the uprising that overtook Baltimore and riveted the world. He lives in his hometown of Baltimore with his wife and 2 children. And I just got a text from the county executive in Howard County who said you are also a good alpha man, like my father and himself. So welcome to the show, Wes. We are so happy to have you here.
It is my pleasure. I tell you, I've been looking forward to this for a long time, y'all. So I'm a fan of your work. I'm thankful for your work. And just really, it's a real pleasure to be here. And please tell my frat brother, Mr. County Executive Ball, that I said A5.
I definitely will. He is watching, so he'll see that.
I think Calvin probably knows that I'm producing the podcast, which is why he didn't text me, right, Candace?
Exactly.
That was the only reason he didn't bring up.
We'll just say your father too. There's a connection. My dad's an alpha, so you know. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite questions, and it's about stories. So we know you have a compelling one. So please start with the Wes Moore story.
So I am the product of activists, of teachers, of ministers, of storytellers. I guess really to understand my story and kind of who I am, we actually have to even go back a little bit where my grandfather was the first one born in this country on my maternal side. He was born in South Carolina, in Charleston. And he and his parents, my great grandparents, were actually ran out of the country by the Ku Klux Klan. My great grandfather was a minister. He was a little bit too vocal, and eventually the threats became very real, and he moved the family back to Jamaica, where they were from. Most of my family vowed to never come back to this country, and most never did. But my grandfather always made it a pledge to come back here. He felt like this was my birth home. This was the place I want to be. And this is the place where I want to make an impact. And so he eventually came back, married my grandmother, who was actually born in Cuba, brought them to the United States. And so that was how this journey to America kind of began for my family. First, where my mom was raised in the Bronx, and then for me being down here. And my mother started working down here in Maryland, right out of school, and eventually she started working as an intern in a journalist's place. And she started eventually. This is probably all bad back in the day, but she started dating her boss, who eventually became my dad. My dad was a journalist in Maryland, and he was a storyteller. And I only have 2 memories of him. The first was when I was about 4 years old, and I was getting into a fight with my sister, and I hit her. And my mother had a big rule about men do not put their hands on women, and it was because of her own past. And as a survivor, she always said, "I'll never tolerate it if I see it. I specifically won't tolerate it if I see it in my son." And so when she saw me hit my sister, it turned all bad real quick for me. So she starts coming after me, and eventually. It was my father who protected me. And it was my father who eventually came and sat me down and explained to me what I had done so wrong, and why my job was to protect my family, not to go after them, why my job was to protect women, not to put my hands on them ever. And the only other memory that I have of him was watching him die in front of me.
Mm.
And as tough as I thought it was going to be for me or for my sisters, I have one older sister, one younger sister. The person who really had it toughest was my mom.
Mm.
Because she was now going to be a single mother in her 20s with 3 children that she was now going to raise on her own. And this wasn't the life that she prepared or the life that she had expected. And she was having a really difficult time with the transition. And finally, she called up her parents, my grandparents, who were living up in the Bronx. My grandfather, the one who came from South Carolina, then Jamaica, back to the US, he was a minister in the South Bronx. My grandmother was a school teacher for 29 years in the South Bronx.
Mm.
And, and I say their house was barely big enough for them, but they figured out a way to make it big enough for all of us. And so we moved up there. And so that became my journey up from Maryland to New York, where, and at that time I was 5 years old. And it was also some of the most confusing moments in my life, that entire stretch where I was literally, the first time that I felt handcuffs on my wrist was when I was 11 years old.
Mm.
By the time I was 12, I was asked to leave school. By the time I was 13, I was sent to a military school. And my life has been just kind of a collection of these fits and starts throughout that entire process that I think in many ways was fueled by anger. And it was trying to put my finger on where to place that anger, where to place that hurt, where to place that frustration. And I'm thankful because I also found people who were willing to actually make second chances mean something. I was surrounded by people who were willing to believe in me in a way that I don't even think at the time I believed in myself. And I now know, and I didn't fully quite grasp it until later on, but I now think I have a better understanding of what fuels me now. And what fuels me now is a direct line from what was instilled in me before. It's a direct line of what runs through my veins. It's a direct line of my DNA. It's a direct line that when my grandfather made a decision to come back to a place that rejected him from his earliest days. When my father and my mother, but my father, when he insisted on giving me a name, I have 2 middle names because my parents couldn't agree. So they said, we'll just give him both. The name that my father insisted on is Watende. Watende is Swahili for revenge will not be sought. I think about my mother, who is a person who has witnessed so much pain at so many different junctures of her life. The first job that she ever got that gave her benefits was when I was 14 years old. The first job that she got that let her work one job instead of multiple jobs was when I was 14 years old. And this is a woman who I think my little sister says it best, where she says, our mother wore sweaters so we could wear coats. She had sacrificed everything for her children. And so I stand here with a clear understanding that not only is this path not an accident, but it was written. It was something that was built through these many incidences of that happened before I was even born, that happened to people who are in my blood, but happened before I was even a figment of their imagination. But in many ways, their journey, their path, their vision, their dreams, and their hope, it might have taken generations for some of them. But I try to live my life as a manifestation of something that they hoped for. And I think so when I think about who I am, I'm the descendant of dreamers, and I'm thankful for that.
Well, that story and those important ideas is sort of how you came onto the scene with the other Wes Moore. And I read that book as well. I felt sort of it seemed to be that's the way that you introduced yourself to the world. And my question on that is, what about this message, the other Wes Moore, I mean, obviously it resonated with so many people. New York Times bestseller, you know, international bestseller as far as I know. Why was this story the one that you wanted to introduce yourself to the world through? And how, and if at all, does it connect to your other works?
Well, you know, it's crazy, Tom, because I remember when I was first approached by it, my gut reaction was no. I don't want to write this story. And I thought for a bunch of different reasons, right? I mean, first I was like, you know, I don't have time to write a book. I was like just starting off my career. I'm like, when am I going to write a book? The second thing was, I was like, I'm not that interested in digging into my own life. And I'm actually not that interested in digging into his, and I'm definitely not interested in sharing it, right? Like, I had known Wes. I got to know Wes. I did not get to know all of his people. I did not get to know, you know, dig into the details of the stories that I had to do when I wrote The Other Wes Moore. This was just a guy who eventually, you know, when I first learned about him was because my mom contacted me and was like, I've got something great to tell you. She said, there are wanted posters in your neighborhood. This is in Baltimore. And I was like, okay, but, and I wasn't trying to be funny, but I told her, I was like, I don't know why a wanted poster in Baltimore is like worthy of a long distance phone call, because I was overseas at the time. And she was just like, because it has your name on it. And I was like, ah. And that actually led to the exploration. So eventually I wrote Wes a note, and he wrote me this note back. And that one note turned to dozens of notes. Those dozens of notes turned to dozens of visits. I have now known Wes for over 15, 17 years. I mean, he's now still in Jessup. He's just starting year 20 of his life sentence. And I remember when I first talked to Wes, I said, it's crazy. Someone actually asked me about writing this story. And without hesitation, Wes said, you should do it. And he said two things that I won't forget. He said, I've wasted every opportunity that I've ever had in life. And he said, so if you can do something to help people understand the consequences for their decisions, but also do something to help people understand the neighborhoods that these decisions are being made in, then you should do it. And that became the focus and the push for telling the story of The Other Wes Moore. I was frustrated by this idea oftentimes that as a society, we are so quick to either congratulate or castigate without having any understanding of background or anything else. Like, it was far too easy for people just to like lift up my story and say, that's the success story. Or look at his story and say, that's the failure, right? Without being able to have the patience or the honesty to be able to actually dig into it. So I wanted to write the book intentionally where let's start at its most elementary point. Let's start when these two boys are young boys. And let's take a reader on a journey. Let's take them through these milestones with these kids. Let's take these kids where both of them at a young age, where I at a young age watched my father die in front of me. He meets his father at 5. Let's take it through the journey of watching their educational experiences, the first time they have interactions with law enforcement, and how that actually changes how they view their path and their place in their own safety in their own society. Let's progress to talk about who are the main influences in their lives. And so it does then get to this point that as we hit the conclusion, we can at least say, I get it. I understand. And it's more complex than oftentimes society thinks it is or allows it to be. And so when I watch the fact that, you know, The Other Wes Moore now, I mean, we're now over 2 million copies. It's now the most popular read for colleges for first year read. It's curriculum throughout much of the state of Maryland. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing because like I never wrote the book for that, but I know both for me and for Wes, who I still see to this day, to watch the impact and the conversations that have been driven around it, to help people understand that the line between our life and someone else's life is really thin. And we can't forget that. I think has been just a very powerful reminder, even to me, as I've then gone through my own career progressions and how I've decided to, you know, which decisions I've made about which issues that I want to take on.
That's so great. My daughter, it was part of her curriculum. She read it in high school. And to this day, she actually wanted me to say this. She's like, that was one of the best books she's ever read.
So sweet.
College, and yeah, and it was part of her studies, and she said it was excellent, absolutely excellent. So
that's so humbling. Honestly, that's so humbling.
Yeah.
And please tell her I said thank you. Please
All
tell
right,
us.
I will. She's actually probably watching, so.
All right, good.
So before we get into 5 days, let's talk a little bit about your work at the Robin Hood Foundation. For our listeners who may not be familiar with the organization, what's the mission of the foundation and how are you working to solve one of our country's biggest issues?
Yeah, and the fact that we even have to deal with the issue of poverty is one of our country's deepest wounds. And so Robin Hood is 32 years old. And Robin Hood really started off with a focus of saying that wherever poverty is either a cause or a consequence, we will fight it. We will fund organizations, support organizations, build organizations if we need to, but to be able to address all the different elements and all the different ways that poverty shows itself. And so whether that is education, whether that is housing, whether that's transportation, whether that's mental physical health, whether it's criminal justice reform, whether it's immigration, whatever it is, Robin Hood will work to find and fund and to build. And initially start off as an organization that gave about $40,000 away a year. Now Robin Hood in its history has given away north of $3 billion into the work. We actually just had a virtual event, a virtual benefit last Monday, in which in a night we raised over $115 million going towards the issue of poverty.
Wow.
And the thing about it is when I think about the issue of poverty, and so the organization, so it's a large, so I run really one of the largest nonprofits in the entire country, especially with a core focus on poverty. But the thing that really gets me about this issue is we've made this bargain. We've made this devil's deal about how much poverty we will tolerate, about who we will accept to live in poverty. Because the thing that really also just gets me about poverty is that not just that it's there, it's that it's so predictable. It's so persistent, it's so sticky, oftentimes it's so generational. And we know exactly how it shows itself, but we as a society have to make a fundamental choice that we are then going to do something about it. We as a society have to make a fundamental choice that there's certain things that we just will not tolerate, and there's certain injustices that we will not condone. And so what we try to do from both a philanthropic side, but then also try to move all the other levers of philanthropy, is say, how can we use catalytic capital, fund things that work, build them up in scale, and then eventually take them to the largest scaler, is the government. Because the reason we have so many structural inequities, frankly, is not because philanthropy hasn't done its job. It's because of policy.
Right.
We have policies in place that are both putting people and keeping people in poverty. So part of the job and part of the focus of philanthropy, and part of the job of how I think about this, this work within Robin Hood, is how do we then push and test every single lever, not just the grants that we make, but also, we've built out an entire policy wing to the organization. And a big reason for that, I have a quote on my desk from Martin Luther King Jr., and it says, "Philanthropy is commendable, but the philanthropists can never forget the economic injustice that makes philanthropy necessary." How do we think about partnerships in a new way and making sure that proximity matters, so that when we think about the people who are making the decisions about the grants, it's not just the ones with the letters after their name and the ones who are relying on data. I'm a data person, but I tell you right now, whose opinions I rely on and who I think about when we're making decisions about everything from grants, what policies push, it's actually impacted communities, because people who are closest to the problems are going to be the ones who are closest to the solutions. And then how do we think about this from a frame of understanding that the impacts that we are seeing within our society? I think about what's happened right now with COVID-19. In a matter of, we have watched 11 years of job growth go away in 5 weeks. We've watched an unemployment rate in the state of Maryland go from around 4% to now over 11% in a matter of 5 weeks. And by the way, 22% of those jobs that were lost were people who were living in poverty already. So think about what I just said. 22% of people who have lost their jobs were people who were living in poverty already, i.e., they were the working poor. These were people who had jobs and were still living in poverty. These were the people that, we just saw a report that's talking about the fact that 40% of people who are making under $40,000 have now lost their job. So we have a level of economic devastation that frankly is unprecedented. We've never ever seen this before in this country when it comes to the speed and the severity. And so when I think about the work of Robin Hood and the organization that I run, it's about how can we move as aggressively as possible in various communities. You know, we're actually now doing investing in Maryland, investing in Baltimore, which I'm incredibly proud of. It wasn't something the organization did prior to coming in. Be proud of me being the CEO. So we're excited about that. But, you know, but it's this idea of saying that poverty shows itself in the most horrible and vicious ways. It doesn't show itself in one way. The problem with poverty is that it will show itself in every single way. And when we're talking about economic opportunity for people, we have to make sure that we are as deliberate about economic opportunity as the structures and the systems have been as deliberate about economic devastation. We have to be just as deliberate to watch the inverse happen.
Unfortunately, and I mean that, that provides a good transition to talking about your book, 5 Days. We are now just past the 5-year anniversary of Freddie Gray's death, and the account of the days following that are in your book. Tell us a little bit about what brought you to this story. Obviously, it's a compelling story, and it had the eyes of the nation on it. And I think, unfortunately or fortunately, in some respects, people still, when they think of Baltimore, Freddie Gray is the next thought in their head. And it's not unfortunate that they think of Freddie Gray, but rather they misunderstand, I think, some of the things that followed. I know I did, just reading the accounts of the 5 years that have passed. Living out here in the suburbs, despite working often in the city, I thought that nothing had changed. And while not enough had changed, there are certain things that are moving in the right direction. So what brought you to this story? And what did you find in researching this book and working on it with Erica Green?
Yeah, and first let me say, Erica Green is a star. I mean,
Yes.
She is a star.
We love
and
her.
Future guest.
And also, we claim her, by the way, in Howard County. Like, let's be clear. We claim
Oh, no. Nah, Candace, I love you. We gonna fight on that. She Baltimore. She Baltimore. But you know, but I think what happened was, you know, even if you look around right now, right, you see things like empty streets and empty ballparks and all this kind of stuff, and it's eerily similar to 5 years ago, when we had empty streets and empty ballparks and all that kind of stuff, and for completely different reasons. And I think one of the things that really compelled me when I first started going through this process of saying, I've got to tell this story, was I remember being there at Freddie's funeral. And Freddie's funeral was kind of like the to-do in Baltimore. Everybody came out to Freddie's funeral. And I only went to the first part, and I never walked down the aisle because I didn't feel like I earned that. I didn't know him. And it was the first funeral I've ever attended in my life where the person who was laying in the casket I had never met before in my life. And I didn't know his story before any of this. I didn't know anything about him. And I felt like that was part of the problem. That showed my own level of complicity in all of this, the complicity of everyone who was inside that church. The fact that this happened on our watch. And, you know, when people talk about how this thing played itself out and how it worked, and you hear this debate about Freddie, where it's like people fall into almost two camps on Freddie, right? It was either the police acted improperly, it's police brutality and so on and so forth, or it was like, well, Freddie was a thug, and Freddie had been arrested multiple times, so what can we expect, right? There was something different about this. One is that if you just look at even the 24 months before Freddie Gray, there was Anthony Anderson, and there was Chris Brown, and there was Tyrone West, and there were other people with similar backgrounds, similar unarmed African-American men, where there was excessive police force that led to their death. Freddie's was just something happened with Freddie that was different. That didn't happen with Tyrone. It didn't happen with Chris Brown. It didn't happen with Anthony Anderson. In addition to that, oftentimes people were talking about the death. And while we have to address the inequitable policing and the lack of police accountability, that is an absolute imperative within our city and specifically within the city of Baltimore. The thing that bothered me just as much was his life. Because the more I learned about his life, the more I learned about this was a young man who was born premature, underweight, addicted to heroin. His mother never made it to high school and battled addiction for much of her life. When Freddie and his twin sister, Frederica, finally gained enough weight to be able to leave the hospital, they went to a housing project on North Carrier Street over in Baltimore. And they moved into the housing project that later in 2009, that and 400 other homes were actually cited in a civil lawsuit because that home had endemic levels of lead. So if you look at, the CDC claims that someone who has 5 microbes of a deciliter of lead in their blood is going to have some cognitive damage, right? 5 microbes. Freddie had 36. So we're talking about a person who was born underweight, premature, addicted to heroin, lead poisoned. By the way, at this time in his life, Freddie's 2 years old. And so it's important context to keep this in mind when we're understanding what happened, not just in Freddie's life, but what happened throughout that entire period. And so what then we wanted to do was take a look at it, not through the eyes of Freddie, but actually take a look at through the eyes of these 8 other people, 8 people who come from a variety of different backgrounds in the city of Baltimore. So you have in there, you have a police major who actually grew up in West Baltimore, who's now one of the leading police officers and is actually one of the people patrolling that area during that time. You have a basketball star turned protester. You have a woman who had been protesting the death of her brother in police, or the death of her brother that happened in police custody for years, and is now saying, I love the fact that the city is now standing up against this, but is wondering, but where was this when my brother was killed? You have an attorney for the Gray family. You have a city councilman from Baltimore. You have
you can't just say attorney. You had Billy Murphy.
You would be right. You would be attorney. The attorney. But who was the attorney for the Gray family, right? You had the head of baseball operations for the Orioles, who also happens to be the son of the owner of the Orioles. And so you had all these people who come from completely different stratas, completely different places in their lives. But there's this crash moment, and this moment is this incident and the 5 days that are surrounding it. And so what I wanted to do was take a look at this incident through the eyes of these 8 people and see it through their eyes, see it through their lens about what exactly happened, and then what do we do about it? And then what I think we then really tried to do at that point is to sum it down where this is not just about policing. It's not just about the unfairness of Freddie's life and the custody, and was the arrest proper and all that kind of stuff. This is about poverty. This is about economic injustice. This is about all the things that come when we have levels of economic injustice and racial wounds that still have not been healed. This is what happens when you have a city that is born and developed through concepts of everything from redlining to discriminatory housing policy, to discriminatory lending policies. When you have a city where the stratas of wealth and complete poverty are literally blocks apart. And so that's really what I wanted people to understand is once again, let's take a journey. Let's take a journey through these days. Let's take a journey through these sets of eyes. And then at the end of it, let's really have a conversation about the type of society that we're hoping to have. And so I've been incredibly excited about the response that we've seen from the book so far. But I think especially in this moment, especially when we're watching the levels of economic devastation that we've seen in the state of Maryland and throughout the country, throughout everything, I feel like it's an important story for people to understand.
There's also a fascinating dynamic in the book where you contrast the commercial center of Baltimore City, the Inner Harbor, with the experience of those who are living in the eastern and western sections of the city. The police described the Inner Harbor as the jewel, and it seemed as if the protesters specifically identified the harbor as a target, if you would say, for raising the profile of police violence. I was wondering if you would comment on that dynamic, because oftentimes when Suburbia says they love Baltimore, they're talking about the Inner Harbor, Camden Yards, Raven Stadium. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and listen, I think everybody enjoys going, going to go catch the O's play and
Right.
go hang out by the harbor and go get something from Cheesecake Factory and all that. I mean, everybody enjoys that, but you bring up a really important point, Candace. But to say you've seen that does not mean that you've seen Baltimore, because also it's not just about. It's important to look at the economic diversification of Baltimore, even though that is important too. It's also really important for people to understand what makes Baltimoreans so proud of Baltimore, right? Like, I'm proud of what we've been able to build in downtown, and that's great, right? And I'll go spend some money down there. I'm really proud though of the fact that we have the Arts District, right? I'm really proud of the fact that we have Antique Row over on Park Avenue. I'm really proud of the fact that we have amazing Black-owned restaurants and places to be able to understand the history and the culture of Baltimore. I want people to experience that too. I want people to understand that Baltimore is complex. Baltimore is uneven. Baltimore is stratified, but Baltimore is beautiful. And it is the engine of the state of Maryland. And so it's important for people to be able to have a full appreciation of everything that makes Baltimore, Baltimore. And the reality is that, and I think we even talked about it in 5 days, Baltimore's had a hard strain. This has been a tough go for the city of Baltimore. And there is absolutely no denying. I remember talking with Erica about it, because, kind of the conclusion, we talk about, all these characters, and we talk about kind of the character of Baltimore. And she's like, this is dark. I'm like, yeah, but I mean, like, we've been in a dark period. It's been hard for the city. Like, and that's real. But it's also really important for people to understand why Baltimoreans do have a natural and inherent sense of pride about what makes our culture, what makes our neighborhoods so great. And so it's important that we invest in the city universally, that we don't actually use public dollars to further exacerbate. It's important that we use public dollars not to create oasis of poverty and concentrated poverty, which oftentimes has been done, but we're actually using public and private and philanthropic dollars to create true opportunity platforms for everybody within the area. It's important that we actually invest in things that can help people to move around. It's one of the reasons I am a very big proponent of public transportation, and why I was so frustrated by some of the decisions that have been made over these past few years about why we should somehow not be investing in that. And to be very honest, it should not. When I think about history and what areas we were trying to connect, maybe I should not have been terribly surprised. But Baltimore is beautiful. And I think it's really important that we not just tell the Baltimore story with sense of honesty, but also really explain and the fact that we still do have some significant things to work on. But I also think it is important for people to understand why all of us who call Baltimore home, why we choose to. I remember when I came back to Baltimore, I had people ask me, like, why? I really could sum it up in one word. People like, what's going on? Why? Is mom sick? Did you lose your job? I was like, nah. It's like, I wanted to come back because this is my community. And I think that's the thing I want people to understand about Baltimore, is that we take the word community very seriously.
And to build off of Candace's question and that last remark, that there's a moment in the history, the uprising history, the 5 days, it's very well featured in your book, where if it wasn't true, it would almost be too literary to believe. And that is Camden Yards. The uprising is progressing down towards the Inner Harbor. There's a game going on, and Camden Yards shuts down, says you cannot leave. And you, as you mentioned, you feature John Angelos, son of Peter Angelos, in the book, and he's sort of getting text messages from the guy who's running the stadium saying, hey, what are we supposed to do? And I found that moment, even though I knew it in the history, I found that moment so poignant, because that has then been the crux upon which suburbia is saying, I'm not going into the city anymore. And I guess what I would ask you, you already commented on the red line, just to be explicit there, but what Baltimore City is segregated even within the city. It is economically as well as racially segregated within the city. Where is the opportunity to provide opportunity and integration of the entirety of Baltimore, so that you don't have the quote jewel of Inner Harbor, and then you have the bad places with the blue lights and the places you don't go? You know, how do we build that out? How do we make all of Baltimore better and not just carve out certain gated communities that we say, well, this is the safe place to go in Baltimore and everybody else stay away from?
Yeah, love that. And you're right, Tom, because I was fascinated by, when you think about those 5 days, even the book, we actually bookend them with baseball, right? Where it's
right.
Saturday was the game that they were playing a game and the fans were asked to stay in the stadium because of the protest outside. And then the 5th day was the game that they played with no fans. And I thought it was just such an interesting and powerful bookend to look that it started and ended with baseball. First of all, something when you think about, it's the national pastime of the United States, and it's definitely the state pastime when you think about all the history of the Orioles. But and I think it's one of the things that, and your question is a really important one, because it's one of the things that I know I think about at Robin Hood constantly, where when people will say, what is it that we have to do to be able to address this terror of poverty? Is it focusing on education? Is it focusing on housing? Is it focusing on criminal justice? My answer oftentimes is yes. That's exactly right. Because that's how poverty shows itself, right? I mean, oftentimes when you have a person who is living under that beast of poverty, under that thumbnail of poverty, it is showing itself in the air they are breathing. It is showing itself in the water they are drinking. It is showing themselves in the schools they or their family members are attending. It is showing themselves in the lack of transportation assets they have to be able to be mobile. It is showing themselves in the fact that they are generally oftentimes over-policed. It is showing itself in every single way, and it is reminding you in every single way that you live in poverty. I came up in environments where it's like, my community was neglected, and I knew it. I knew it. And so when we talk about how to address a fundamental breakdown, we have to address it with a fundamental buildup. We have to be able to start from its earliest ages. When I was actually asked earlier today, they said, what phase of education would you put the most investment in? I was like, that's like asking me, which one's my favorite child, right? But if I had to answer that question, if we do not put a greater level of focus on early childhood supports, then we are not just missing a boat, we're making it incredibly expensive on ourselves. And when I say early childhood, I'm not just talking about, kindergarten or pre-K. I'm talking about first, let's make sure that we have babies that are born healthy, right? Let's start there.
Right.
And then from there, then we can talk about the fact that we still do have a 30 million word gap for affluent children and children who are growing up in poverty. Let's still talk about the fact that we still have children who are entering their first school and not knowing basics like letters and numbers and colors and basic words. Let's start with the fact that we have a massive summer learning gap within our society, and now that is going to be completely exacerbated when you're looking at what happens with COVID-19. We spend a lot of time thinking about this issue, and a lot of capital thinking about this issue of this gap that exists between students when they leave in June and they come back in September, that if those months aren't productively used, it can take until November for them to catch up where they left off in June, the summer learning gap, right? What happens when the summer learning gap isn't June? It's February.
Mm-hmm.
What happens when we have a quarter of the kids in this state have not logged on once? They don't have consistent Wi-Fi, technological assets. And let's not forget, that's not quote unquote their problem. That's all of our issue. And it's important that we address it and think about it as such. How do we think about the fact that even if you can give people the best job training skills in the world, you can give people the best platforms for employment, if it will still take a person an hour and a half to go from West Baltimore to their job in downtown Baltimore, then what have we done? So we have to be able to invest in things like public transportation and get people means and methods to be able to go from where they live to where they work. Without that, you are completely cutting off their opportunities. And in addition to that, when we're talking about employment, we have to be very smart about the fact that we have still structural barriers that are keeping people from being employed. And just one example, we're talking about people who are returning citizens and those who are returning from incarceration. So you can say we fund some of the best job training programs in the world, fantastic job training programs, and it's great. And then we'll tell people, so absolutely come back and work. You've got skills, you've been trained up, that's fantastic. But by the way, you can't work here because you have a criminal record. Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, you have to check boxes every time you put together applications, knowing the fact that 75% of people who have to check a box will not even complete the application because psychologically, they've already been eliminated from the process. And you can go out to school if you choose to. That's fine. But remember, you don't qualify for Pell Grants. And if you can live where you want, but remember, you can't live in public housing, even if your family's there. So we continue to add these asterisks and these caveats to people as they are returning home. And that's just one example that as a large society, we have to think holistically about what it means to not just prepare people to be productive members of our large society, but actually to be a real space where opportunity and ambition can actually meet. Because if we don't have those spaces where ambition and opportunity can actually meet, you then will create a society of people who will figure it out on their own. And the problem with that is the answer that they will come to is oftentimes not the answer that any of us would choose for them, or frankly, the answer that we would choose to have upon ourselves.
Yeah. So we know leadership is so important, whether it's elected, appointed, selected, whatever kind of leadership, in making sure that the policies address the big challenges in education, housing, health, etc. But we also know that we need community members and advocates and activists to push for change. It's a collaborative effort. I think you talked a little bit about this. We did watch the interview that you had with Dan Porterfield. And so I think you talked a little bit about collaboration. And so what's your advice to our listeners on how to best advocate for equity, whether it be in education, housing policy, whatever?
I think the best piece of advice that I would give to listeners about how to advocate for equity is proximity. I think you need to get close to it. I tell my team all the time that there's only one promise that I will make to you about this work. Every day your heart will be filled. Every day your heart will be broken. Every day. Every day you will see something that will bring you to tears of joy. Every day you will see something that will bring you to tears of pain. But that's because we believe in a culture of proximity, where you're never going to be able to be the strongest advocate or the strongest supporter of something if you don't inherently understand it, if you don't feel it, if it's not something that makes your heart beat faster. And so that also means for a lot of people, it means you have to be good about getting to know, right? It means not everything can be your issue, and that's okay. There's certain things people bring to me all the time. They're like, oh, I want you to advocate for this, or I want you to advocate for that. And I'm like, listen, I love it. I support you. Not my thing. It's just not my thing, right? I have but so much space, but so much energy, but so much time. I know the things that I'm going to fight and advocate for. I know that I'm going to fight and advocate for a fact that every child deserves a chance at academic success. I am going to fight and advocate for the fact that we need real economic opportunities and real job prospects for all of our people, because without that, we are living a hopeless lie. I'm going to advocate for the fact that I think that one of the greatest tragedies that we have is the fact that we have never been serious about climate change. And if we cannot address that, if we cannot address the environment, then you know what? Everything else we're talking about is simply going to be details. And we're not going to be able to afford any of that other stuff, because let's not forget, some of the most consequential and expensive push-offs we have made have been the push-offs we have made on the environment, right? So these are things that I know I will fight for and I will advocate for. I can't do that for every issue. It's not me. I don't believe that that's how people really be built. But I think that the one thing I would ask people to do is to be proximate. Spend time, get to know not just an issue. Don't just read op-eds on it. Go talk to people. Go understand why that issue matters. Go understand what that issue is doing to them and their family. Because when you know what you are fighting for and you know who you are fighting for, you never stop fighting. No day is too hard because you know who I am fighting for. And that's what I would urge people to do.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. So we end our show with the same set of questions. They were originally called rapid fire, then they were called elevator questions, and finally we have the elevator 8. You are the first that's getting 8 questions. Now, I do want to just note that they were originally called rapid fire, so they are supposed to be somewhat quick.
Yo, that's like, I can't do that, Tom. I'm not quick.
I also think, like, I do believe that you even commented about the unpopular benign opinion on Twitter one time. So I feel like you're ready. So the first one is, what was the last, and you have to hit all 3, book, movie, and music recommendation you made to a friend or family member?
Ooh, book 5 Days.
All right, that's fair. That's
there you
fair.
go.
Just kidding.
No,
So
that works, Wes. That works.
that works.
That works.
I mean, I can't do that. Though.
All right.
I will always accept more book recommendations.
Actually, I would say Tightrope, book by Nick Kristof and Cheryl Dunn.
Love that.
It looks at poverty in rural poverty. And, one thing when I think a lot about this idea of economic inclusion and economic exclusion. And I think one of the mistakes we make as a large society is we think it's an urban issue alone. It's not. And in fact, we spent a lot of time now in rural communities. And in some ways, the challenges that we're seeing in rural communities can be just as damning. Take COVID-19 as just one example. One of the reasons that I'm terribly concerned about the impacts of COVID-19 in rural communities is not that the numbers are hitting as high, it's actually that there are less resources to deal with it as the numbers do rise. Right? You don't have as many community hospitals. You have a much greater probability of shortage of everything from nurses and doctors and orderlies and et cetera. So that book is fantastic also because I'm a data person. I like numbers. I think for me, the written word is much harder for me. I have to work harder at it than I do with numbers. And I think that book just did a beautiful job of telling stories. TV, movie
and music.
Movie.
We've been trying to sneak in TV, but
right. That's like a new thing. People are like Netflix. I'm gonna tell you about Netflix.
Yeah.
Oh no. Well, I'll get to TV in a second. That one's easy for me. But movie, actually, no movie though, is The Greatest Showman.
Oh.
So the first time I saw The Greatest Showman was we took our kids to Benji's. And I don't know if y'all know Benji's, but Benji's is a drive-in movie theater. Over in Anne Arundel County. It's great, man. It's like I think it's something like 60 years old or something like that.
Wait, is it open right now?
It's not open right now because I think they still have a prohibition on Benji.
Okay.
So it's not open yet.
Come on, Stuart Pittman, you can let that open. That's fine.
But it's great. It's really fun. And so, but we go out there, we park the car, get our popcorn, put on this thing. It's called The Greatest Showman. It's Hugh Jackman. It's not. I'm like, oh God, this is so boring. And I loved it, and the kids loved it, and they still sing the song. And so we've now refound The Greatest Showman since COVID-19. And so it's such a cute movie. It's a great movie. A lot of great lessons, a lot of great stories. TV show easy for me. The Last Dance.
All right.
Oh yes.
The Last Dance.
I'm halfway through. I'm on episode 6. I'm behind.
Well, I won't spoil it. The Bulls keep winning. You gotta see it. It's really good.
The Rodman part. Oh my God.
Yo, the Rodman was crazy.
I had no idea.
You had no idea?
I remember this. No. I remember. Yeah, I remember this. I grew up like watching this, like, and I was a huge Bulls fan, but I didn't know Rodman was that crazy. Like, I knew Rodman was a wild man, but like this exposed crazy Rodman.
Yes.
You didn't know he took a time out to Vegas?
Oh my gosh.
I'm telling you, Tom, you have to get through it. It's extraordinary. It's so well done. And I tell you, it's also really powerful leadership lessons.
Mm-hmm.
When you watch, and not even just Michael, because people often talk about how Michael led and da-da-da. For me, is also a really powerful lesson for Phil Jackson.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
how do you lead a team with such disparate personalities
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
and put them all on the same sheet to have a singular goal and to win and win and win and win? I mean, it's incredibly well done. Incredibly well.
That's a really good point. And then he went to LA and did the same thing.
And did the same thing.
Right.
Same thing. It's crazy.
What's the most unpopular, benign opinion you hold?
Yeah. So I'm part of, I think it's 3% of the world, who, to me, cilantro tastes like soap. And I know, and people love cilantro. They put cilantro on everything and it's not. If someone puts the smallest piece of cilantro on anything that I eat, it has then just ruined the meal for me. Because I'm now tasting soap. And again, I've been told it's seriously, it's like a genetic dysfunction. 3% of the world actually have this. I am in that 3%. And with all due respect, I would ban cilantro tomorrow.
All right.
If I could.
Wes,
And I know a lot of people hate that. Supposedly
Just for that 3%, that's a little rough.
Exactly. Sorry, 97.
This is such a great interview, and then we got to this.
What podcasts are you listening to?
Besides this one, I'd say two. One, just a selfless plug, Future City.
Yep.
On WYPR. So I have a podcast where we actually talk about the Baltimore region. And the kind of the tagline is we move the conversation from what's wrong to what's next. And so we look at innovative things that are happening all around the globe and really ask the question, why is that not happening here? Could it happen here? And so it is everything from how can we think creatively about transportation to how do we think creatively about policing reform and being able to look at what's happening in San Antonio. Or how do you look at the cleaning of the bay and being able to look at the fact that Boston, that was the dirtiest body of water in the United States. Now they literally do swim contests in the Boston Bay in a matter of 20 years. So it's like, how have places from around the world thought differently, pushed things differently? We actually just did a show recently on COVID-19. And some of the things we're talking about is the fact that, in New Zealand, they now have, part of the reason why people say, how did New Zealand get rid of Corona? New Zealand has universal testing for COVID-19. When they're asking, how did rates drop for young people in Germany? Well, part of it is that school children in Germany are tested every 3 days. COVID-19. So there are interesting ideas and concepts that we can pick up from around the country and from around the world, and then ask that question, could it actually work here? And so I love that. Another podcast that I really do like though, is something called Angry Americans. And Angry Americans is started by one of my guys. His name is Paul Rykoff. He's the founder of Iraq Afghanistan Veterans of America. I'm a former paratrooper. I'm a very, very proud member of the 82nd Airborne Division. And when I came back from Afghanistan, I met this guy who was just this unbelievable voice for veterans issues. And his name was Paul Rykoff. He was really advocating for the fact that we have so many people who are coming back home. And frankly, we were breaking a lot of promises to them and their family members about what would happen to them and their family if they chose to put on the uniform. Men and women who, when the country said, we need you, they didn't ask the country to wait. So why now we had soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines who were waiting 9 months to see a doctor? And so I started working with IABA, eventually went on the board. We partnered together and did a lot of advocacy work, everything from the lifting of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was you might remember, is a barbaric law where they were asking people about their sexual preference in the military that had anything to do with anything. So we advocated for the lifting of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and we're ecstatic when we got that lifted. The post 9/11 GI Bill, but he has a new podcast now called Angry Americans, which I love. Which he, part of the things he says is that if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. And I think there's truth to that. That we all should love this country too much to be satisfied with where it is. We all should love this country. We all should love this country too much to be okay with the fact that we have still so much inequality and lack of opportunity for far too many people. And so I'm digging on this podcast.
the best meal in Baltimore? And this has to be something that folks can go out, well, can order and have delivered to their home or pick up safely.
Yeah. So first, I'm glad you asked this question because I think it's really important for people, and I wish we were being told to do this more. But if you can, I think it's important for, call it 2 times a week, to go order out. Like, I'm a huge cook. I love cooking. And my wife will tell you I can cook really well.
Okay.
Wes Moore cookbook next. Huh?
Wes Moore cookbook. However, at least 2 times a week, we will eat out. And for no other reason, it's a principle because what's happening to our restaurant industry right now in all of this, two-thirds of all jobs that have been lost during this have been in the hospitality industry, i.e. things like restaurants and hotels. This is doing so much damage to the restaurant industry and so much damage to restaurant workers who oftentimes are low-wage workers, oftentimes entry-level jobs. And so we have an opportunity to be able to support these industries in better ways by even doing carryout right now if we cannot get in there. So I would actually urge people, if you can, twice a week, pick a place, pick different places, order out, support them, support these, the restaurant workers. But if you're going to be in Baltimore, I would select.
What's your place? Yes.
I would go with Cipriana, which is over in Canterbury, and go get the lamb chops there. It's crazy. Lamb chops or the salmon, they're both really good. And then I gotta go with Ida B's Kitchen.
All right.
Ida B's Kitchen, the fried chicken and Ida B's, and the Liberian collard greens. If you get a chance, you have to check out both of those. Both of those 2 places. Really, really good food, really good people there. And again, these are all folks who they deserve our support.
Cool. And sometimes I'm starting to think that this question might not work because the people we have on this show are so busy and impressive, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What activity or hobby have you rediscovered during the quarantine? And the presupposition is that you've got downtime. So what are you doing now that maybe you didn't do before the quarantine?
Bedtime.
Ooh.
So because the fact that Robin Hood is New York based, I have to travel a lot back and forth. And people sometimes ask, they're like, y'all didn't move to New York when you took over Robin Hood. It's like, no, I didn't move. Like, we're Baltimoreans. This is where we want to raise our kids. This is where we want to be. This is our home. This is our community. And so I will commute back and forth. But what this has also meant is there have been quite a few nights that I've had to miss bedtime. Either in transit or because I had to stay in New York because I had late meetings or early meetings or whatever the case might be. Quarantine has been difficult on a lot of different fronts for a lot of people. But I think if there is one thing that I'd say that I've been able to rediscover that has been an absolute joy and something that you don't even think about, and see, again, sometimes it's the small things in life. It's bedtime. It's the fact that when your kids lay down, that you can lay down with them or read them a book. Or now that they're 6 and 8, have them read you a book. I miss that. And I didn't realize as I was doing the back and forth so much, just how much I missed it.
Very nice. What's the best advice you've ever received?
Best advice I ever received was from my grandparents. And my grandparents gave me a Bible before I left for Afghanistan. And it was one of these little green Bibles. One of the little ones that kind of like fit inside your breast pocket, inside of my flak vest. So every time you went on a mission, you put on a flak vest and your Kevlar and all your protective gear. And inside the Bible, they wrote the words, "Have faith, not fear." Mm. And I remember I would say that before I'd go on every mission. And I would just repeat it to myself, "Have faith, not fear. Have faith, not fear. Have faith, not fear." Every mission you went on. And I now find myself, I do it now, like when I'm going in front of a big meeting, when I, am feeling like something don't feel right. Have faith, not fear. Have faith, not fear. Because I feel like some of the worst decisions that I ever made were decisions that were based in fear. And some of the best ones I made were ones that was based in a rooting of faith. And I think that's it's not just the best, but it's the most sturdy advice that it's the most sturdy advice that I've ever received.
This is our new one that rounds out our 8 before we get to our closer. And that is, what was the biggest challenge or failure of your life, and how did you learn and grow from it?
Oof. I'm wondering where to begin. I think one of the I think one of the toughest I take it back to the military on that. Our deployment was difficult. It was challenging. Literally, and a true story, and I don't think I've ever shared this publicly. My wife and I, we actually eloped halfway during my deployment. We were engaged as I was leaving, but the plan was for us to get married after I got back from the full deployment. My grandfather passed away when I was in Afghanistan, and they had a rule that the only way you could leave a combat zone is if it was a direct family member, i.e. like a parent passed away or a child or a spouse. But because my grandfather was like my father growing up, they made an exception, and the Red Cross advocate said, he should be able to go to his grandfather's funeral. So they let me go to my grandfather's funeral. And my wife and I, during that time that I was home, we escaped and we went and got married. It's kind of fun. We literally, Elvis married us. We ended up having the ceremony, but we actually have pictures of us getting married by Elvis. And part of the reason was because there was this level of fear that if something were to happen to me, the Army would treat her differently as my fiance than they would my wife, right? But I think about some of the things that we had experienced and done over there. And I think there were some really important lessons that I learned, even from some of the missions that we went on and some of the things that we saw, is that every single day has to be deliberate. None of us have any form of luxury to know what today will bring, what today will pop up. No one has guaranteed any of us anything. And so the moment that you let your guard down, the moment that you cruise, the moment that you just kind of go along to get along, it's amazing how nasty life's sense of humor will be with you. And so I think one of the most important lessons that I learned from my time over there was every single day, it's important that you be deliberate with that day. And it's important that you approach every single day with a level of intentionality, because you don't know what being lackadaisical and the consequence of what being lackadaisical will do or bring to you.
And our closer, what do you think we need to do to elevate Maryland?
We need to invest. We need to invest our time. We need to invest our resources. We need to invest our compassion. We have to understand that, at times like now, where we're being asked to stay distant, stay away, at a time when we're looking at budgets and we're being asked to say, everything must be cut. Everything must be pulled back. Nothing new can be thought about or done. I ask us to think differently. I ask us to think that, sometimes the best way to get through scary is not to cower. The best way to get through scary is go faster. I ask that we be thoughtful. I am as fiscally disciplined or whatever else as you want to say, right? I also know this, is that we are living under the consequences of underinvestment. And the people who repeatedly end up getting hurt are those who we've repeatedly underinvested in. I look at the fact that even if you think about the space of COVID-19 in the state of Maryland, the reality is that COVID-19 has been universally impactful, but it has not impacted all of us the same. Neighborhoods that were already living in poverty, neighborhoods that are already part of the working poor, communities of color, et cetera, have been hit disproportionately hard by this. And there is a repeated lack of underinvestment that we then scratch our heads and we wonder what is going on. And so the thing that I would ask people to do as we're elevating Maryland right now is actually stare at the scary and go hard. Don't cower. Follow instructions and do the social, do all that kind of stuff, because the truth is that we are still dealing with a virus that we do not know enough about, and we're still dealing with some of this killing people, right? Got it. However, as we are thinking about what these next steps are, understanding that the future of where we live will be determined by us. We will help determine that. And the other thing to remember is that this is not the time to actually think small. This is the time to think big. And this is the time to make sure that some of these challenges that we are facing that are now being exacerbated, we actually have a unique opportunity. We can be thoughtful, we can be compassionate, we can be hard, and we can be visionary. And all those things can exist in one frame. I'll say this one thing. I'm sorry, Tom. Tom was like, "This is not short," and I apologize. There's a great song by an artist called Desiree, and it's called "You Gotta Be." Oh. And the chorus of "You Gotta Be" is, you gotta be bad, you gotta be bold, you gotta be wiser, you gotta be hard, you gotta be tough, you gotta be stronger. You got to be cool. You got to be calm. You got to stay together. All I know is love will save the day. Mm. And I think that in many ways is how we should think about this next step. We got to be cool. We got to be calm. We got to be wiser. We got to be hard. We got to be tough. We got to be stronger. We got to be cool. We got to be calm. We got to stay together. But all I know is love will save the day.
Wow. All right.
That's why we ask the questions, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we ask.
It's so good. It's so good. Y'all are so good, man. This is great.
Well, we are so fortunate that you did decide to stay in Baltimore, and I know from all the people. I mean, as we said in sort of the pre-show talk, your name has come up in many of our other interviews, and they're all people that care about Baltimore and want Baltimore to be better, and it's so great to have a thinker like you and someone that I mean, proximity, what you brought up before about proximity, that is going to stick with me for a long time, because that's the reminder that you don't get to deal with socioeconomic issues on a drive-by basis. You don't get to just check in and check out. And so I don't know, I'm rambling now, but thank you.
We can go on and on, truly. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for coming on, and thank you for all that you're doing.
God bless you.
Truly appreciate it.
Thank you for all you're doing. Sincerely, I'm a big Tom elevator. So
I love it. I love it. I love it.
All right. Thank you, everybody.